Hi, this is Bob Wells here, and welcome to Undercurrent Stories. I hope you enjoyed today's show. Since July 2024, the UK has had a new government, with Labour winning a majority and marking an end to 14 years of the Conservatives serving the nation. Former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak described the Conservative defeat as a sobering verdict delivered by the British people, with much to learn and reflect on. However, as Harold Wilson once said, a week is a long time in politics, and it's now been 8 weeks since the election. Those Conservatives, having retained and won their seats, now have an important job as His Majesty's opposition, serving their constituents and, at the time of this interview, choosing a new leader. On today's show, I'm delighted to be joined by one of those MPs. Her name is Alicia Kearns. Alicia is a Conservative MP for Rutland and Stamford and has been an MP since 2019. She is currently Shadow Minister, Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and prior to the election she was Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Hello and welcome to Undercurrent Stories, Alicia.
Thanks for having me, Bob. It's a joy to be here.
It's great to have you on. Thank you again for coming on. I have to ask, is there still a period of learning and reflecting going on within the party?
There is, and I think it has to be an ongoing journey. You don't just learn lessons like that overnight. And I think, for me, it was all about the fact that we need to go back to basics, which is ethics and competence. And we have to show that that is who we are. And we have to show we've got ideas. That's what we really need to do. And I think the long leadership structure that we put in place, I was on the board of the party that helped decide that. I was absolutely determined really to make sure we had 4 candidates and it goes for a longer period so that we can eke out those discussions. But most of our candidates are saying, once I become leader, that's not it and we're sorted. We need to go through policy. We need to rethink how we approach things. We need to go back to our basic values. And yes, we've got to win back trust. And that is not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And do you think that there's still a polarisation in terms of left and right of the party to some degree that is sort of causing a few issues? Or are people beginning to realise that, you've got to talk, you've got to get together and come up with a common consensus?
So I think within Parliament, we are actually the most unified we've ever been as Conservative MPs. And I think, A, because obviously we're bruised and we've learnt our lessons, although, as I said, there's a lot more to learn. But B, because we're a smaller group, so we can be more cohesive and work closer together. And I think what you're hearing in Parliament is a lot of the rejection of kind of left-wing, right-wing, one nation, hard right, all that kind of, unfortunately, people love to put labels. And my thing as a Conservative is, if you are willing to stand as a Conservative MP, you put yourself through a lot of hate. And if you are still there and standing, you are a determined Conservative. And actually, it's unhelpful because none of us can be put in one box. Some of my colleagues might be far more socially conservative than me, but I might be far more conservative than them when it comes to welfare or defence or another issue. And so actually, putting people in boxes is never helpful. And I think we've learnt that in Parliament. But we need to make sure that our widest membership recognise that as well, that they come with us on this journey of recognising that we are all Conservatives, we are all standing on the same core values. And yes, it is healthy to have debate within a party. It is healthy to have challenge. What we're seeing at the moment in the Labour Party, particularly when it comes to, for example, the nationalisation of railways, is we're not seeing any discussion within their party around the kind of sensitivities, the nuances. Are there limits? Are there constraints? What should we do if this doesn't work? And that's really important within a party to have that healthy debate.
Before we talk about your life serving as an MP, I'm really curious to know your life's journey and what brought you into politics.
So from a very young age, my parents were always quite political in our household. They were always talking about politics, but actually it was less about Labour versus Conservative, although they were both very, very left-wing. They were hardcore Labour voters. It was more about kind of people, communities, policies, that kind of sense of responsible citizenship and duty that you have, not only to your local community, but actually to the global community that you are a part of. And so from a young age, I was always brought up to have an interest, particularly in foreign policy, which was their real passion. And then throughout my career, I've always tried to work where it's about helping people, engaging people. So at the Ministry of Justice, working in comms, but to support victims of crime. My job was solely working with survivors and victims of crime to make sure they got the justice they deserved. Then I moved to the Ministry of Defence, where it was running the Scottish referendum campaign to make sure that our country stayed as one, and that I was doing a lot of crisis comms, so kind of helicopters being downed abroad. dealing with nuclear leaks. And then I got a phone call one day saying, would you like to come to Foreign Office? We're doing a lot of work on counter-terrorism. This was the time of the rise of Daesh. And I said, are you mad? I don't know anything about counter-terrorism. This is not my background. They said, look, we think you're really well suited to this. And I came across, and it was the best decision I ever made because it moved me into national security. It moved me into doing counterterrorism, hostile states, all the things I love. And so that's kind of, my background doing counterterrorism and hostile states for a long time before I came into Parliament. But in terms of the kind of going into political journey, I often joke that I lost my mind when people say, why did you do this? But I was in the civil service and I was very frustrated with the fact that there was almost this policy across too many people of the kind of just enough. So I'd always get told, Alicia, you've done enough, or that's enough, or we don't, and I'd say, no, that's not going to achieve our goal. That's not going to help the person we're trying to help. That's not going to break through the barriers. Or, we are in government. Our job is, and this is a civil servant, our job is to make the system work harder for people, to break down barriers and to enable their lives. And I became that scrutiny function within the civil service. And I thought, well, if I can do that here, imagine what I could do if I was an MP. But I didn't actually think about standing until one of my ministers said to me that I don't know what your politics is, but have you ever thought of being an MP? Because that's really where you should be. And I'm really grateful to her for asking me that because it started me on that journey. And then it also started, I started a few years earlier on my kind of journey of changing my political views as well, because obviously I had to transition from that Labour household where I was, equally very left wing until I was 16. And then slowly as I got older, my politics started to transition.
And how did your family react to that change?
So it's really interesting. So my dad was Irish. So he grew up with the Troubles and he was very involved in trade unionism from the age of 11 he was 13 when he left school. So he was very involved in trade unionism. But my dad, because of the Troubles, always taught me never hate political opponent. You can strongly disagree. You can fundamentally think that their approach is wrong, but you should never hate. And so they never had a problem with it. And I remember sitting my family down and talking them through it. I remember taking friends for dinner to almost come out as a Conservative. And actually what was really interesting is as I went through that transition, people were surprised, but they didn't have a go at me. But what was sad was that once I actually became a member of Parliament, I did lose friends. Oh, really? And they wouldn't even do the courtesy of telling you. They would just suddenly ghost you. And you just thought, well, I haven't changed who I am as a person, same values as I've had for the last 10 years before I become an MP, the same things I believe in. And I just thought it was such a shame because I have loads of friends on the Labour benches, the SNP benches, less so since the elections. I've lost a lot of my closest friends on the other benches. But it was a real shame, actually. And it's just not, my approach is always public policy, outcomes, the national interest. And so it's a real shame when people let party politics blind them.
I'd just like to know a little bit more about life as an MP, work-life balance. I mean, there's a lot that you're doing. I mean, you've only got to look at your website. There's an awful lot going on. There's a lot going on in the world and the country and locally. What is life like as an MP in terms of how many days a week are you in London? How often are you travelling? Is it 7 days a week? Do you get much time with your family? Could you just tell listeners a little bit about that, please, Alicia?
Yeah. So I don't think anyone can know what it's like to be an MP until you are one. I definitely was ill-prepared, didn't know what I was walking into. So in terms of the practicalities, so I did a school run on a Monday morning, take my son to school, drop my daughter at nursery, and then I go to London. And when we were in government, I was able to come home on Wednesday nights, which was wonderful because it meant that actually I didn't see my children only on Tuesdays. I saw them Monday mornings, I saw them Wednesday nights. And then Thursday and Fridays, I would do constituency visits, which is essentially going out and meeting businesses, charities, local organisations. Almost always those visits are because there is a problem that they need help with. And then, of course, doing my surgeries. And then as per tomorrow, Saturdays, I also do quite a lot of constituency visits. But it's mainly kind of big community celebrations like marking 50 years of, the Oakham Rangers Football Club and things like that. Sundays, I'm quite protective of. And essentially, I've always said to my team, look, on a Sunday, of course, if it's Remembrance Sunday or if it's a big community event, then I will go. But on Sundays, I try to only do it if my family can come. So village fetes, great. Kids can come. They have a wonderful time. But I'm quite protective of it because my children, well, as you know, children are young once and you only get one chance to be a parent. So It is strange, and I have to say, going back to an empty flat, in London 2-3 nights a week, it's not ideal, but it's the reality of what it is. But it's a very strange job because people don't really know what an MP does or what they're meant to do, and we have changed the role over the last, particularly kind of 8 years, and the pandemic definitely changed things. Technically, the job of a member of parliament is to do national legislation. That is our job, to scrutinise what the government does nationally and internationally. My colleagues around the world, other MPs, find it utterly bonkers that I spend my time knocking on doors. They cannot understand this concept. I go knocking on doors once a month, every month, and they're like, what are you doing? They find it bonkers that I go from tweeting about the risk of war in the Balkans and what's going on in Ethiopia and Somalia at the moment, which is my job, and talking about national legislation and how unhappy I am with, for example, nationalising or VAT on school fees, all the way through to, did you know this new coffee shop has opened? Isn't it wonderful that we're getting a new village hall built in Barradon? They think it's mad, but that is the joy of first past the post politics. You have this close connection as a member of parliament to your local community. And that's really the bit of the job that fills your heart with joy, which is that kind of silent work helping people. So every week we probably get about 300 people contacting my office, and I have the most amazing team. And together we make sure that we help people. So, somebody who, I've got a case at the moment, someone's partner went to prison for being domestically abusive. He's been released early from prison. They haven't put the tag on him, which his probation requires him to have. And on the first day on probation, he went to the village in which she lives, even though he is banned from being there, and was walking up and down her street. That is the kind of issue that an MP gets involved in, and you need to be taking action to support them. The woman who turned up on my door the week before Christmas with her freezing cold baby in her because the boiler broke and the landlord wouldn't help them. We got her inside, gave her a warm drink, gave her all the heaters from my office, and by Monday I got her a new boiler installed. That is what MPs spend a lot of time doing now, and there are a lot of people in need. And the pandemic really shifted that relationship from being national legislation really to being helping people who need it. But as much as it's not meant for the job, and it's very difficult to do all of it with the national and international, it is so worthwhile because you are literally changing someone's life every single day. And it's, and a lot of it is tackling bureaucracy. The man whose driver's license got revoked when it shouldn't have been because he was in poorer health, but it actually shouldn't have been clinically removed from him under the rules, which meant he couldn't drive his wife to her weekly cancer appointments, which obviously was putting enormous pressure on them as a family. You get his driver's license reinstated. Now, you haven't changed the world, but you have given a family in a tough time dealing with cancer the ability to make their lives easier. So it's a very strange job. There are a lot of awful things about it, and the death threats and the abuse and the dehumanization of politicians is dangerous. It's not just horrid to experience, but the ability to help people in their darkest moments where they think everything else is gone and no one will help them, that is what keeps me and my team going. And you will quite often find us in floods of tears just going, thank God we've been able to get this person something after years of fighting, and that's why we do the job despite how awful it can otherwise be.
And I guess your team at the office, they filter some of that stuff coming in, do they?
Yeah. So my team have a ban on me looking at the inbox, which I break, and I get in a lot of trouble with them because on a daily, I can't help it. I see the emails coming in, I want to see them, and I want to respond to people I want to help. But you get about 1,000 emails a day as a member of parliament, which is bonkers. Yeah, it's essentially a full-time job upon my team is managing my inbox. But I can't help it, and I drive them mad because I'm like, I've just seen this come in, and can we do this, and we can help this person? God, this is awful. Can we get back this person straight away? But they're great at filtering, and particularly on the kind of threats and stuff, they're amazing. But I think people underestimate when you work for an MP, you form a very close bond with them, and they really struggle seeing the hate and the abuse. And it's not necessarily the death threats, because then you go straight to the police. It's the kind of everyday email that says, you're corrupt, I know you're evil, you don't deserve to breathe, you're just a bad person, or I know you're not going to read this email because you think you're superior to us and all this kind of stuff. And you're like, well, and that's difficult for them because they're having to read it and absorb all the negativity, but also it's just not nice on a kind of daily basis to have this routine grinding down that happens.
Yeah, I've noticed not just on your Twitter feed, but or X feed, most politicians' feeds is just full of negativity when you say something. So the other question related to that is life as an MP when you're in Westminster. We see the politicians warring when we watch the television. When you're together, shall we say off camera, does everybody get on with? Do most people get on? Do they drink in the bar, or do they tend to stay in the same parties while they drink?
So it's a really difficult one to answer because every politician's different. So
of course,
my issue is that I take everything to heart. So, and that's a good thing because the moment I stop caring, taking everything to heart, I need to get out of this job. But I'm less likely to be seen in the chamber losing my mind, being really aggressive and really party political and tribal. However, there are times at which, of course, you are so angered by something that you do. So most of my colleagues know I have very good relationships cross-party because you don't see me doing that. And if I do engage with someone, it tends to be courteous but strong and, and kind of commanding of my position. I find it difficult. If you came into the chamber and you went for me really nasty, I don't think I could just ignore that. But a lot of my colleagues really can. It's a real skill. A lot of people can really go at it in the chamber and then behind the scenes be best friends. So I tend to prefer for everyone to take a really respectful tone in the chamber. I don't like the gladiatorial kind of, sand in your eye, insults, cheering, jeering. I don't think that's how we get the best politics. I don't think it's how we get the best policy. I don't think it's how we get the best outcomes for our country. But behind the scenes, there are a lot of friendships that people overlook. And actually, sometimes it's easier to be friends with someone who isn't in your party because people in your party see you as competition, even though I wish they didn't. Yeah. And so I had, a very close friend of the SNP, a very close friend of the Labour Party who mean the world to me, the two of them. And they're just wonderful. But no, you see a lot of mixing. When we all got back, lots of MPs from other parties hugging you, saying, I'm so pleased to see you back. Let's keep cracking on our work on Bosnia, or let's keep cracking on our work on this or that. And in the bars, people do primarily stick to their parties. But I don't spend a lot of time on them, so I'm not putting them at best as well. But no, there are a lot of cross-party friendships. There are even cross-party relationships where people are married or dating from across parties. And I wish we saw more of that because Parliament is at its best when we reach across party lines for the best citizens of the country. And that's what you saw on the Foreign Affairs Committee so often. That's what you see on foreign policy so often. And it's so powerful and it's so important. But yes, and I think that what's a shame is that particularly the new intake and the new parties, and we saw this with my intake in 2019, we had such a big Conservative intake that people become quite insular. It's the same now with Labour, but tenfold, which is that you have hundreds of Labour MPs now who don't know that behind the scenes we're all respectful of each other, who don't know that behind the scenes we're nice to each other, that don't know that when we're in the lift, you do say hello, how are you, nice to meet you, my name's Alicia, what are your passions, tell me about them. And they've come in with quite a wall, and it's quite difficult to penetrate it. I'm trying to be nice and say hi, and I'm finding that actually I'm just sticking to my old Labour friends because the newbies, they've come in with quite it feels like almost like student politics approach. Whereas what's really interesting is on our newbies, because they've been so, I think, scarred by the election and being told they've got no ethics, they're desperate to be courteous and make friends and reach out. And so we've got to settle the new Parliament, essentially.
I'd like to talk about local, national and international stuff that you're involved with. So from a local perspective, I mean, there's a lot on, isn't there, to do with protecting food supply, growing, the Great Stink in Corby Glen. One that I sort of I've got a lot of affinity for is the A1, where you've got you've got basically a section of the M1 north of Peterborough to Blythe, which is motorway speeds, at least, with lorries, and then you suddenly get a central reservation crossing, and you think, hang on a minute, how's that going now? Because I know you were quite instrumental in sorting that out, weren't you?
Yeah, so the A1 is a 20-year project, and this is what's so difficult with things of this difficulty. But we all drive it. We've all seen accidents. We've all sat there. Whether I'm doing a school run and I find myself suddenly not moving because of an accident at Colsterworth or Great Ponton, which is where most of them happen in our patch, or stopping on a slip road when I shouldn't have to stop on a slip road because the lorries aren't moving over. And so I've had lots and lots of meetings with Highways England, and I was really pleased that in the last Parliament I managed to get 5 safety upgrades to the A1, which was good, and they've made a difference. And I think our section at the south has become safer. However, it's not enough. And Highways England have said that never, if they were building a new road now, would they be allowed to build the slip roads that we have, and they wouldn't be allowed to build the central reservation crossings we have, which are literally dirt tracks going onto the A1. I mean, it's bonkers, and the accidents are so severe and so bad. So what I've managed to do is I have actually convinced them to do a review of all central reservation crossings across the whole of the A1, because obviously once they agreed to do my bit, they said, well, we're going to do the whole thing. So that will take them about a year, sadly, but essentially they will review whether we need to close them, whether we need to completely upgrade them, or whether we need to do something else altogether. Then obviously I'm pushing for safety upgrades we delivered as well, but there's also two other things I've asked for, which is a new sign. So essentially, I can't change the slip roads, but what I can do is try and get a new sign built, because there isn't one in the country, that says, short slip roads, please move to the right. And I genuinely think that it would be transformative, because local people know to move to the right. You see it as you go past slip roads. But that traffic, I mean, it literally goes from the very south to the very north of our country. It's the the old Great North Road. I think that sign would work. And I secured a debate in Parliament in my second week back, and the minister seemed genuinely interested in it. So I'm desperately hoping that we can get one at trial in our area. And then the other thing is, obviously, the way in which they prioritise investment in roads is based on how many fatalities there have been and how severe the accidents have been. I understand why they do that when they need to prioritise. However, if you live in a rural area like ours, even though that A1 is so busy, you are going to have fewer accidents outside Great Ponton than what you are going to have, for example, outside Loughborough or Nottingham or Manchester or somewhere like that, where the volume of traffic is so high. So what I'm asking them to do is essentially to consider fatalities per capita of the local area, so that we recognise population density as part of this consideration. So there's a lot of work ongoing. I'm going to keep raising the A1. I will keep fighting. The biggest thing is the central reservation crossing, and then the sign, I think, will make a big difference. So I've just got to keep fighting.
But you mentioned that could take 20 years.
Well, the long-term big safety upgrades could take 20 years. Central reservation crossings, I want action within the next 5 years. I want to see upgrades. I want to see closures. So no, in the next 5 years for me, it's signs and central reservation crossings. But the long-term, how do we make this road fit for purpose? That is a 20-year discussion.
The other local issue is the Mallard Pass solar farm.
Oh, yeah.
Which is an interesting one, isn't it? Because, on the one hand, we do want green energy. I don't think there's many people who would disagree with that. And then on the other hand, you had the Secretary of State basically sort of putting it straight through. So this is essentially 2,105 acres of farmland that's going to have solar panels on it. I mean, the company doing it say that there's still going to be grazing taking place in that area. What is it that you're against on that, Alicia?
Sure. So my opposition to it is on a number of areas. So first of all, the process of the sign-off I find absolutely disgraceful. So essentially, Ed Miliband came in and they were all told as ministers, within a week, we want you to make some big policy announcements to show that, this is our new path and route. And they signed off 3 mega solar plants in 3 days. You cannot read over 1,000 documents per application in less than 3 days. You cannot give it serious consideration. The law says that the Secretary of State should spend 3 months reviewing these. So to do it in 3 days, I find to be so grossly disrespectful to our communities. One of the solar plants he approved, the civil servants even said to him, don't approve it. Like, this is not a good idea. We should not be doing this solar plant. But he did it, and that was his big announcement from his first kind of week in being in power. And so I find it quite farcical and also very frustrating, because local people matter and they feel railroaded and ignored. All 3 solar plants were in Conservative voting areas as well. And I have to say, I can't help but feel bruised by that, not least because I have never, ever taken a position based on how it might hurt a different party or how people vote. So it's very frustrating. In terms of the issues, so the first is the fact that it is good quality. It's some of the best quality agricultural land. So over 50% of Mallard Pass is the highest quality agricultural land you can have in the country. 30% of England's vegetables and fruits are grown in Lincolnshire and Rutland, and yet we now have 14 solar plants proposed for Rutland and Lincolnshire. Over 50% of all solar plant proposals in the country are in Lincolnshire and Rutland, despite the fact that we are the breadbasket. Now, Italy has banned all solar on agricultural land. They've said, no, we have to protect our national security. Food security is a national security issue, and that's what we saw with Ukraine. Food security, wheat, it really matters. So first is the loss of agricultural land, which I think is really, really difficult, and there's no monitoring of the cumulative impact of how much good agricultural land we're losing. Second is the impact of solar. We should be investing in wind. What is our greatest asset as a country? It is wind. That is why we are now the biggest offshore wind country in the world. We've done that over the last 14 years. We have made us the kind of Saudi Arabia of the wind of the sea. And I'm really proud of that. But I was also one of the MPs that changed the law so that we could build wind onshore, because I recognise it's more we can do. Now, the thing about wind is that you can continue agricultural farming around wind installations. This idea that we're just going to have to put sheep under every single solar plant, that was good agricultural land that was arable. That's what it was growing for us. So wind is a far better energy source for our country in terms of production, but so on. But the third reason, and the reason I've been particularly vocal, is that the companies behind the proposal, there's issues with two of them. The first is Canadian Solar. A report by our Foreign Office found that they are the most complicit company in the world in the use of Uyghur slave labour, which is part of the genocide that's taking place in Xinjiang.
Oh, this is the northwestern part of China.
Yeah, so this is essentially the Muslim community within China who have been put in detention camps. There has been forcible rape of Uyghur women every single month to try and remove it from their genes. The children are taken away and put into camps. They're not allowed to speak their language. They have to adopt new names. It is a full-scale genocide what is taking place.
I understood that I know we're not in the EU, but I understood that the EU had banned products from that area and also the US had. Is that right?
They have. And we've banned cotton from there, and we've banned a few other products, but we haven't dealt with polysilicon, despite the fact that that is the main component in solar, and that is the main thing. And this is one of the things that I was shouting at my own government about. We are becoming the dumping ground for slave labour-produced solar panels because the EU is bringing forward this new policy. The US has brought in a new policy. And the company trying to build in our patch, so not only have they been declared the most complicit in it, but secondly, they have been done for tariff dodging by the American government where they're sanctioned. So their suppliers are sanctioned to not allowed to supply solar panels to the US. What they did was they put their panels into Thailand, shoved one screw in and pretended they'd been made in Thailand. So they're tariff dodging. And they also rang my office and asked what I wanted to drop my opposition to the solar plant because I was causing so much trouble. Did I want a new school, a new swimming pool, a new playground? And that to me is verging on the illegal. They were very careful not to cross the line, but it was utterly shameful. The company they've partnered with, Windle Energy, have never built an infrastructure project in their life. I went through company's house in great forensic detail. Every company this guy has ever owned has gone bankrupt, owing shareholders over £100,000. And then it's very odd because it wasn't until a few weeks ago that actually his wife, who's a teacher, was the primary owner of the company. So these people are completely ill-suited to deliver anything in our communities. The way they have engaged with our communities has been appalling. The lack of community consent, the lack of community compensation they're considering. But there are fundamental issues around food security and there are fundamental issues around loss of agricultural land, let alone the Uyghur genocide. And it's fascinating because some people want to accuse me of being a NIMBY. I've been talking about the Uyghur genocide since 2014. When I stood for election in 2019, people look at my leaflet. I even mentioned the Uyghur genocide in a local leaflet for Rutland and Stamford. And so it's just heartbreaking to me because we've been put in this place where essentially the government has said, we are happy to go green on blood labour. There have to be standards. Otherwise, it's essentially a modern form of colonialism, imperialism. We're happy for the dirty. I mean, solar is quite dirty at source when you make it. It's just lovely when it's packaged up and turns up with us. But we are happy for all this dirty coking to go on, the use of slave labour, because it allows us to go green here in England to feel good about ourselves. We have to go green. I'm a member of the Conservative Environment Network. I have consistently pushed for legislation changes that have made us more green. But the idea that we should accept it where there is such complicity in slave labour shames me.
Moving on to issues on a national level, the big one, I think, for everybody at the moment is immigration.
Yeah.
Nobody seems to have been able to grasp it. What are your thoughts on that?
So immigration is so complex. And I think we have to have a very honest conversation with the public, which is, one, we have to deal with issues at source. So people who don't want us getting involved abroad and who think we should be more insular in our approach, that is not going to deal with the migration crisis. We have to go to source countries and we have to be willing to stand up for our interests and support them to prevent people feeling the need to leave their countries or stop the conflicts that are driving people to move. There is a mixed bag, and there are people who are moving solely for economic reasons, and there are those who are moving because they have no choice, because they are refugees. Yeah. Secondly, we have to have an honest conversation about what are our country's immigration needs. Immigration went up over the last few years? Yes, it absolutely did. But after the pandemic, we made a choice that, yes, we were going to put through all the visas for the healthcare workers and the doctors who were trying to come to our country. Why? Because the pandemic had absolutely flatlined our NHS. They were in crisis because it is not possible to go through a pandemic without all that need that just sat there for 2.5 years with no one getting help and not bring in more people. Social care. I will never apologise the fact that we had to flood more people into our country. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't mistakes made. There were issues around people playing the system. There were fake visas. There were fake social care companies. That's where the National Crime Agency comes in. And again, we need to make sure we are policing and doing things properly. But did we need more people? Yes, we did. We also can't pretend or talk about immigration in a way that we don't recognise the enormous contribution immigration makes to our country. So, for example, tertiary education. When I go around the world and I meet foreign leaders, prime ministers, the King of Jordan, different countries, they have studied here in the UK. My ability to therefore achieve the geopolitical aims that I need to protect our country, which is the foremost goal and job of any government, is to keep our country safe, is so much easier when they have studied in the UK. So I think we need to have a really honest conversation that people are very unhappy with immigration at the moment. I think primary concerns come from a sense of fairness, which drives deep in every British person, whether it's queuing in a shop and you see someone queue jumping and you lose your mind, all the way through to the idea that people are playing the immigration system. The biggest problem we have with immigration is people overstaying their visas. That should be the absolute priority because that is utterly unacceptable. There is no reason for you to be overstaying your visa unless, for example, you've had a stroke and you're in hospital. And that is a 0 point, whatever else it is case. The focus has to be on competence and fairness. Let's stop people overstaying their visas, which is the biggest issue we have. Small boats, we've got to work incredibly hard because the only people benefiting and profiting from that situation is the organised crime gangs. And I know that because I spent 3 months in Greece pulling people out of the water when they were crossing at Lesbos from across from Turkey. I have, however, therefore, people who want to say to me that everyone crossing that boat is a refugee. I know that's not the case because I have seen the people land, rip up their passport, pretend they're from a country like Syria when they are absolutely not, because they're coming for economic reasons. But I've also met the 13-year-old boys from Pakistan who, yes, are not fleeing from anything, but whose families have come together in a village and said, we're going to send you, our lovely child, because you're the middle child and we're willing to risk your life. We're happy for you to travel to Iran, to Iraq, Iraq to Turkey, Turkey to Greece. So what if you're raped on the way? So what if you drown in the ocean? If you make it, you are to work illegally and send us back money so our village can be more wealthy. Those children deserve protection and support because they didn't choose age 13, 11, go through all those things and endure the most appalling atrocities. They were forced to, and they feel guilt and they feel they have to send back money to their families. So what I really dislike essentially with immigration, I'm sorry for giving such a long answer, is that we have polarised it and made it so extreme when essentially it's just about fairness and competence and making sure that we can run a functional system. And it has been overwhelmed and it's been very difficult with all the crossings and everything else. But I'm also very proud of, for example, our Syria programme. I'm proud of Homes for Ukraine, which I helped create and design. I placed over 200 families in our communities alone. And I'm very proud of what we've done for Hong Kongers as well. So we need to have the right balance, and that's what we haven't got right over the last few years.
I think it is a very complex problem, and I think most people realise that. But I think a lot of people have a feeling that people are coming across Europe. Europe are almost turning a blind eye to it.
Yes.
And they're ending up in the UK because they have a great life in the UK.
Yeah, so I will only talk about people that I met in Greece and therefore my experience, but I did meet hundreds of people over those months who were coming across. And they didn't all want to come to the UK, but those who did, no one will want to hear this, but none of them knew about the welfare system. What they knew about was the fact that they thought there were jobs aplenty. They assumed the streets were paved in gold and that you could come, and almost like the American dream. But the biggest reason was they all spoke English. Why? Because the English language is the most common second language. They all understood English. They felt they understood our culture from watching us on TV. They knew about the Queen. They knew about, our cultural icons. They knew about tea, about Paddington. And it was our soft power that made them think that the UK would be a super welcoming country where they could understand the language, they could be able to get a job, they're able to, just turn up and it would be absolutely fine. And I would try to explain to them that was just not the case, that you can't just turn up and everything else. Some of them had friends and family there, but actually I met just as many who were saying to me, I've got family in Germany, I've got family in Norway. Almost every, that's true, that's not true. I would say over 60% of the refugees or the migrants that were crossing I met spoke English. And I'd say to them, you're going to Germany or Denmark? And they're like, yeah. And I was like, do you speak German or Danish? They're like, no, but I've got family there. And I was like, okay, fine. So what I found was that people were either going to a country where they knew someone or they'd been offered work. And the biggest pull to the UK was our soft power. They felt they knew us, they felt they knew our country, and they knew the language, and they just assumed that jobs were everywhere and they could just arrive and just do it, and that would be perfectly legal. Because in their countries, you don't have national insurance. You don't have to do formal employment contract. It is all done in the black market. And it was really difficult to try and explain to them that just isn't the case. Were there probably some who did know about the welfare system? Probably. But I have to say, what I mainly heard was people just thinking we were Great Britain and it would be a great place to live. And I think people really struggle with that. But that, all I can say is that that's my honest experience. And I don't think I've been played. I think it's genuinely what they had, and particularly from some of the younger ones.
Another one that's quite topical at the moment is water. Mm-hmm. The government have said that there's going to be a lot of penalties for people if they're found to be discharging sewage. I was listening to Fergal Sharkey, who's a bit of a voice, and he was saying that he thinks the legislation's already in place, but it's just down to the enforcement of it. What are your thoughts on that?
So yes, the legislation is in place because we put it in place. I think for a lot of us as Conservatives, the narrative around sewage is really, really difficult and frustrating, because when we came into office in 2010, if I'm right, I think it was 6% of all discharges were being monitored. That was it. Like, there was no interest at the time in monitoring. And we decided, not because of a massive outcry, because do you remember anyone between 2010 and essentially 2020 ever talking about it? We decided as Conservatives that conserving our waterways was really important. And so what did? We put in place monitoring. And between 2010 and now, we have gone from 6, I think it was 4 or 6%, I don't remember the exact number, of sewage discharges being monitored to 100%. That cost a lot of money. It was a lot of investment. We did it quietly. No one really cared or was interested, but we did it because it was the right thing. So we've gone from a position where no one knowing about what's happening to having all the data we needed and realising there was a real problem. Now, when you realise there's a real problem, you have to take action. But when we left office, the biggest court case against a water company was going forward, thanks to us. We were about to do further action to withdraw, I was literally sitting down with our former DEFRA secretary talking about this the other day. We were about to withdraw the ability for them to draw dividends down if the company had paid badly and was doing lots and lots of discharges they shouldn't be doing. We had done the biggest fines that have ever been done for water companies. Had it solved the problem? No. Was there more we needed to do? Absolutely. Had we cracked it? No. But we had put significant efforts in it. I was on the BBC, I think, with Stephen Fry talking about this. And he was saying, well, the only solution is that we nationalise our waterways. That's obviously the kind of route that I fear Labour's going to go. And I said, Stephen, with due respect, the Olympics are literally about to kick off in Paris. And they said they don't think they can do the water activities because their nationalised waterways are so polluted with sewage discharges. It was almost constructed as if it was the Conservative choice to kind of flood our waterways with sewage discharges. What was really frustrating is that this is happening across the world. We have taken action. We've got some of the best and highest monitoring of any country in the world. We hadn't solved it. I wish we could have done more. We needed to do more. We all put our hands up to that. But what we saw over the last few years was such politicisation of it, where, for example, the Liberal Democrats laid an amendment, which we had to vote again, which said that overnight, literally the next day, we would have to essentially change our sewage system. The amendment sounded great. The whole country was writing to me saying, you have to vote for this amendment. If I had voted for it, the cost was 400 billion overnight, and we'd have had to rip out all of our Victorian waterways, and we would have had sewage in the street in people's homes. Why do we have sewage discharges into our waterways? So that it's not going through our streets, so it's not in our homes. And this is the thing about governance, where we need to get more grown up across all of our parties. And my party, absolutely, look at the lesson we've just been taught. But you cannot play politics where you pretend there are easy answers to incredibly complex things. You cannot say, oh, we should just do this overnight because it sounds good. You would have flooded our streets with sewage if I voted for that amendment. I could have done it, great, and I wouldn't have got any abuse, and everyone would have said, wonderful, Alicia wants to do the right thing. We would have had sewage in our street. And that is the great frustrating thing about politics. People lay amendments just to make other people look bad, and it's really frustrating. But yeah, sewage, we have a lot more work to do. I really wish the Labour government every success with it. It is not easy, but I'm really proud that we have left them with 100% monitoring. We put in place those fines. As Fergal says, we put in place the legislation that is needed, and now I hope it can follow through the work that we put in place.
Most people would agree that the actual infrastructure needs renewing.
Yes.
because it goes back to Victorian
It's
times.
Victorian, yeah.
Yeah, some people would say, well, hang on a minute. A lot of these we hear about the shareholders earning tremendous profits from this.
I agree.
Something not quite right there.
It goes back to the fairness point, exactly the same with immigration. How can it be fair that these companies are making vast profits? I'm having an argument at the moment with one of our local water companies because they're saying they can't afford to fix something. But I say to them, we've just paid out these enormous sums. So I'm pretty sure that you can find the money to do this, even if you've got to hire additional contracts. So yes, it does go to the heart of fairness. And I absolutely agree. And, absolutely. But nationalisation is most certainly not the answer, as France has shown. But yes, that is why we were striking at the heart of exactly those kind of bonuses. And that's why exactly we have plans to bring forward more legislation on dividends. And I suspect that we will now see the Labour Party bring forward the legislation that we have been proposing to do.
Moving on to the NHS, but not the whole of the NHS, because I think we'd be here for many hours or many days or weeks. Let's just talk about GPs. Most people would agree that to get a GP appointment it's almost like winning the lottery now. What's the solution to it?
So I don't think there is one solution, and I don't think anyone can really answer the question of what the solution is, because we need wholesale reform. We need to really sit back and take the emotion out of the NHS and look at what we need to do to make it function. What I will say is, though, there is also a societal issue where we have two problems. One is that we have created this narrative that it's now impossible to get a GP appointment, whereas actually working with constituents on a daily basis who ring me and say, I can't get an appointment, and I say, well, actually, have you used the app? I need you to go on and do this. And then the next day they do it and they're like, oh, I got an appointment today. Or people who say to me, oh, I rang between 8 and 9 and couldn't get an appointment. And I say, yes, because it's an emergency triage at that time. Try again at 9:10. They get an appointment. It has dramatically improved. I can only speak about my communities. We've had a 19% increase in the number of GP appointments available locally compared to 2019. That is a dramatic increase in the number of GP appointments that are available.
Oh, so since before the pandemic?
Yes. So if you look at 2019 versus 2024, we've had a 19% increase in the number of appointments available. Phenomenal. We've never had so many doctors as we currently do locally. But there are two problems. One, which is that we've convinced ourselves that you can't get an appointment, which actually is not what I'm finding with people who have it. What people are struggling to get, however, is those longer term health checks, not an urgent need. I'm not quite sure what's going on and I want to see my specific doctor. That is the challenge. That's what people can't get. And particularly in rural communities like ours, where people are used to seeing that specific doctor who's done their family, their brother, their sister, everything else like that, and they trust them. And I understand that element of trust. That is where the issues are. Plus the ability, the fact that you can't now just turn up in queue, which a lot of people are used to doing. The second issue is that we have to recognise that the way in which healthcare has been provided has changed. So nurse practitioners, for example, phenomenal. They can prescribe antibiotics. I've just been to one myself this morning. She's phenomenal. There are nurses. Sometimes you don't need to see a doctor. You need to see a pharmacist. For example, Rutland Late Night Pharmacy, incredible pharmacists. Again, they can do some antibiotics. They can do all sorts of different. And yet we still instinctively, me included, when we ring up, want to see a doctor. Whereas actually you can sometimes see a nurse practitioner or a pharmacist. So there are various shifts we need to make. But yes, we do need to make sure people have confidence and they don't have it. And rebuilding that confidence is incredibly difficult. The NHS as a whole, there is reform that is needed. And I'm not the person to give those answers. And I need to spend some time thinking about what we do locally. But my priority has always been, what do I do in our communities? And I've got the new GP practice from Elton when they needed one. There was 36,000 people being served by one practice, which was the highest in the country. And when I look at Stamford now, that is my next priority, is how do I get more health services? But it's not just about a GP clinic. It's about a health service clinic that offers beyond just traditional GP services. We've got a new treatment centre coming to Stamford, £14 million centre. I'm looking at trying to get further clinics within Rutland as well. How do we have a comprehensive health system? So, yeah, I wish I could give you a better answer from the NHS nationally, but for me, I'm just focused on my local communities and what I need to do, and that's what I'm cracking on with.
I'm pleased that things have improved in Rutland Oakham area. I look forward to you doing what you did there over in Stamford.
I bet. No, so I will be cracking on. In fact, I've held a lot of meetings on that over the last 2 months, so they can rest assured that when I'm on something, I'm on it. And we're cracking on.
Yeah. So now we move on to the international stuff. I'm going to focus on the big stuff. China.
Yeah.
You have some great concerns with how much we rely on China for our goods. Could you just explain to listeners what those concerns are, please?
Sure. So it's dependence that's my concern. My priority is always, as I said, the national security of our country. And national security is not just about military and the Foreign Office. It's about economic resilience. It's about societal resilience, democratic resilience, and societal resilience. And the problem is that we have states who behave like terrorists in the way that they are conducting themselves. Russia, we saw the Skripal attack on our shores. Obviously, we've now seen the renewed illegal invasion of Ukraine. With China, we see a country that is willing to break all the rules for their own progress. Now, yes, their job is to protect their people and to secure advantage for their people, but the rules-based system matters, and they are eroding it on a daily basis. They are creating debt traps around the world. They are seeking to undermine the economic system we have, for example, through BRIC. And as we know, they are playing, not only they're conducting a genocide and human rights abuses in Tibet and other places, in Hong Kong, which of course is absolutely appalling what we've seen take place there, but they are actively seeking to undermine other countries and states, not only their democratic systems, but also their economic resilience. And that is a problem. The biggest risk, of course, is an invasion of Taiwan, which has never been part of China. But Xi Jinping has made it as part of his irredentist kind of oppressor state narrative that he will retake Taiwan. 30% of global trade goes through Taiwan Strait. The UK would absolutely be crippled if that happened overnight in terms of the consequences. No one thought Ukraine. I think the average person, if you said to them, if a country is invaded as far away as Ukraine from the UK, would that really impact on our economics and our system? They've gone, I don't see how it would. They've learnt it does. Taiwan would be that exponentially worse. And the challenge is it is not acceptable to have states behaving in ways that they are undermining the international security frameworks on which we rely, let alone intervening in a hostile way on our shores. We had the Chinese consul general beating up and hospitalizing Hong Kongers. We have them tracking down people on our shores. The way in which China is behaving in our shores is the behavior of terrorist groups, and that is not acceptable.
So in terms of goods, I mean, we get our app on Amazon.
We do.
We want to buy electrical goods or clothes or something, and we want it tomorrow, and it's relatively cheap.
Yeah.
Isn't it more in our hands as consumers?
Yeah, consumers have enormous ability to influence the ability of it, and actually, China's economy is in a really bad way. Whether it comes from their housing market all the way through to their currency, they are really not doing very well at the moment, and they've got a social care crisis which is impacting worse on that. We have that ability to make choices without question. But I don't want us to cut off all relationships with China. No. I don't have a problem with us trading with China. I don't have a problem with people buying from China. What I have a problem with is us not standing firm when China does something that erodes the safety of our country, when they do something that involves them acting in a way that breaches the rules and restrictions and the rules-based system. That is where I have a problem. And so it is my job as a parliamentarian to reduce the worst excesses of their efforts to undermine us, whether it's stealing our technology, whether it's undermining our democracy, whether it's undermining or abusing or hurting our military. That is my job. Consumers, I would like to make informed choices. TikTok is the best example of this. I got it banned off government devices because it was a security concern. I have never called for it to be banned across the country because I want people in this country to engage in critical thinking and say, do you know what? I don't want to be on a platform that has been specifically created to be weaponized against me and the people in my country, that is banned in China because the Chinese government, and it's the Chinese Communist Party that's the problem here, not the country of China, but they themselves have recognized that it's so weaponized and toxic that they won't allow their own people to access to it. But if you just ban it, people will not have that cognitive discussion and critical thinking process they need to go through that will stop them jumping onto the next version of it. We have to allow people to be empowered to work those things out for themselves.
What evidence have we got that China's undermining our democracy?
Well, although I can't really talk about it, I think the fact that obviously an individual who was working for me was arrested and charged with treason for spying for the Chinese state, I think gives you an example of it. The fact that they have sanctioned British politicians, which sounds like it's just a sanction, it's not. It has had meaningful impact. The fact the Chinese government has rung universities and said, you will not accept the child of that British politician or we will pull the funding for your university. the fact that we have videos of Chinese spies going into our universities, putting USBs in and taking out all the data of sensitive technology that have been developed by our universities. The fact that they have been going into universities and banning people from speaking openly, trying to get Taiwan removed from things. The fact that they have the Confucius Institutes that teach an alternative history of China, but also is a perfect place for them to bring together spy network. There is so much evidence of what they are doing and technology they are stealing, and ways in which they are trying to make us less safe. And the problem is, it is their job to protect their people, but it is not their job to undermine us and our people.
Moving on to the Israel-Hamas conflict, how do you see a solution there?
I mean, there is no solution in the short term. The long term is a two-state solution. That is the only solution that there has to be. There has to be an allowance for self-determination and the security of both peoples. And unfortunately, we have been a long way away from it too long, and people ignored this crisis. And I think I am the only politician in the world who in 2023 said that we are going to see the Gaza crisis of 2023. And I wish I was wrong. And I hadn't seen it coming as it did, but it happened. And only 3 days before October 7th, obviously, we had the White House saying that this is the safest Middle East we've ever had. It wasn't the safest Middle East we've ever had. They'd just been ignoring it. And all the signs were there, as I said. So the only solution long term is a two-state solution. But in the immediate, we need to get to a place where the current peace deal, which is on the table, gets approved. And unfortunately, having had some meetings about this only this week with other government, we are not as close as I would like.
Moving on to the Russian-Ukraine war. Since you were in government and when the new government came in, what changes do you think there have been in terms of support for Ukraine?
It's quite a difficult one because obviously I've met President Zelensky. He is very, very upfront that it's only because of Britain that Ukraine has been able to do what it's been able to do in terms of us leading the way diplomatically, in terms of weapons, in terms of sanctions, you name it. We have to support them, and I have raised this with the Labour government now publicly twice, because I know in their hearts they want to support Ukraine, but I think it was the end of August, mid-August, President Zelensky went out and did an interview where he said that the British government has saved thousands of lives, and without British government, Ukraine wouldn't be where it was, but that since the Labour government had come into power, support for Ukraine had slowed. Now, that should worry and shame us all. But secondly, for a president of a country who is so reliant on UK support to come out and say that is extraordinary. And he won't have done it off the cuff. He won't have just said, oh, let's, do it. I know him. That says a lot about how unhappy he was with the state of the relationship. So I have raised that the Labour Party now twice on the floor of the House and in Westminster Hall, and they have promised that they will make sure that Ukraine gets what it needs, and they will have our full support. I don't want this to be party political, but that is extraordinary for Zelensky to come out and single out the UK alone as having slowed our support to Ukraine. And we cannot, particularly at this current moment, because they are fighting for our freedoms. We have to make sure they're successful. Ukraine has to win. Putin has to lose, because the message it sends to Xi, but also in terms of all of our security and stability, and also particularly the safety of those neighbouring states to Russia. I want to see complete support for Ukraine, because that is what we've always given and we must keep doing.
Thank you for that. And in terms of UK safety in the world, how do you view it at the moment compared with some of the other times in history? So if we go back to, say, 1990 or 1980 or something, are we in a more vulnerable position now than what we were then? What are your thoughts on that?
I think I've never had a question put to me in that way. It's an incredibly difficult one to answer, because we've gone from the threat back then was obviously states behaving in a very open state of conflict with us. And obviously the Cold War was coming to an end, but then there was lots of hope and aspiration, so on and so on. Then in the early 2000s, and so that's the 90s was probably kind of the high point of everyone thinking we were safe and happy and everything was going to be glorious, and Bretton Woods had finally achieved its goals. Then in the early 2000s, you had terrorists who behaved like states. And so you had the rise of terrorism, the threat from terrorism, then you had Daesh and the kind of view of the caliphate and everything else like that, and terrorist groups trying to occupy land and own them. And now we've moved the period of states who behave like terrorists. We are in, I would say, more conflict than we have ever been. But the conflict is more hybrid in nature, and therefore it's more difficult for the average person to recognise that we are part of a conflict. And whether it be economic, societal, informational, whatever it is, we are in a state of conflict with far more countries than we've ever been. But also more countries than ever before have been involved in that jigsaw piece of conflict. And the biggest threat for me is that I think, and obviously I wasn't old enough at the time, but in the Cold War, I do think there was more of a recognition that all of us have a duty to play when it comes to national security. And my worry is that in the Iraq War, we started a process which has continued since then to say to the British population, don't worry about national security. We've got it. It's above your heads. We will keep you safe. We don't need to have you as part of this conversation and discussion. Whereas in Sweden, every single January, every single member of the public gets a letter through their door that says, if we are invaded by the Russians, they will put on radio that we are not fighting, we've handed over, and we're very happy to be back in and taken over from them. Do not believe them. We will fight for every centimetre, every household, we will save. We have a situation where, whether it's TikTok, whether it's what people are sharing online, whether it's who they're investing in, who they're buying from, to your point about consumers, people think they have abdicated their responsibility towards our shared security. Every single member and citizen of our country has a role to play in keeping our country safe. And that is the biggest change we need to make over the next 10 years. Everyone, I mean, the fact that there was a poll out saying the lowest number ever of people in our history have said they'd be willing to defend our country if we were attacked. I mean, we should be horrified by that. So we need to restart that conversation about critical thinking so people can do the thinking and understand the complexities, so they're not walking the British streets flying the Hezbollah and Hamas flags, suggesting that these people are liberators when they are terrorists. And we need to go all the way through so that people feel a sense of shared duty and responsibility when it comes to national security. That is what we've lost, and that is what ultimately will keep our country safe and make sure people don't inadvertently help hostile state or choose to essentially harm our country, whether it's be joining a terrorist state or actually acting in a way that somehow supports them.
That's an interesting thought. I mean, I just wonder, is it a societal effect where we have almost quite a degree of comfort in many places where, you know, we can watch Netflix, we can order a bit of food off Uber Foods or whatever. And war seems like a long way away. Is it something to do with that, do you think?
Absolutely. Not in my backyard. You know, I don't need to worry about it. And our lives are easier. And the bigger, but one of the bigger issues is the plethora of information. So I think when we had fewer news sources, people were more reliant and more engaged, more focused on what that news was saying to them. Nowadays, everything is grey. There's no real black and whites, right and wrongs. You know, it's very rare that you can really put something in that box. You know, the renewed legal invasion of Ukraine was wrong. And yet there are people who want to suggest it's white and it's fine. The plethora of information is overwhelming to people, and conflicts, whether it's Israel, Gaza, or Ukraine, or Taiwan, are complex. They are not straightforward. And that is, I think, psychologically quite difficult for people because they've got so much going on and so much information, they haven't got the time to sit and think about it and really take a position. But also, as soon as you take a position, you are going to be attacked and pilloried online, no matter what your position is. If you said that kittens were cute, you would be inundated with abuse, saying you are wrong and cats are, you know, witches spawn and God knows what else you might get thrown at you. And so it is easier to disengage from critical thinking, disengage from complex international affairs, and just adopt either an extremist view or quite often what we risk is that kind of acceptable view, which quite often can be labelled as woke, but essentially people jump into a box where they're safe, they don't need to critically assess, and they can just adopt a worldview and that's it, and they don't question it. And that's really dangerous because the most important thing in the world is that we always question ourselves, we interrogate information, we seek out truth, and we're willing to accept that we can be wrong and that information can change. And we are making it a place in this world at the moment where you cannot have a conversation where you can say you are wrong. You cannot, a changing of a mind is a U-turn, particularly if you're a politician, and nuance is not acceptable. And that, for me, puts us in a very dangerous place and actually is a breeding ground for hate.
It was interesting what you were saying earlier on. When you were brought up, you were encouraged to challenge arguments within the family in a healthy way, and nobody took it personally. And I just wonder if social media has had something to do with it, because it's like emails. If you write an email, you can very easily get into an argument, which is almost one-dimensional, because all you're trying to do is, and you perhaps use the wrong language, one word in the wrong place. Is there a requirement, do you think, for more debate at school when kids are younger, to actually realise that actually it's not a personal attack if you don't agree with somebody? that you're talking about the facts.
100%, absolutely. I haven't worked out how I'm going to run it in my new constituency, but I've been running a debating competition with all my local schools, where they're encouraged to hold lots of debates in the year leading up to it, and then they come down to Parliament as a big debating competition between all the different schools, because it's so important. And the ability to, I remember in year 8, I fell out with my best friend at school over Pearl Harbor. And whether or not the bomb should have been dropped in Japan, that we've had such a big falling out over it. But it was important because we learn about the importance of being able to have that discussion without, being that angry and upset. And there is a big problem. So people are unwilling to be challenged. People are unwilling to reconsider their own position. But the most dangerous is this view that essentially in the past, if you had a really extreme view, you probably couldn't find anyone else in your immediate community who would reinforce that or support you with it. Incels are a particularly good example of this. Whereas nowadays, you go on social media and you will find somebody who reinforces, re-radicalizes, pushes you further down that route, and then takes you other directions that are even more dangerous. And that is what is making people particularly entrenched in their positions. And the reduction in people going out and having dialogue with new people face to face. Everything being pushed online, it is very dangerous because it distances, it dehumanizes, and people. I get emails from people that are so abusive sometimes. And I write back saying, "Would you want to be written to in your workplace in that tone?" And they say, "Oh, I didn't think anyone would actually read my email." Well, what? What do you mean? You've written to me. Of course, I'm going to read your email. So yes, you are absolutely right that social media, the immediacy of it, has reduced the ability for debate, and actually people need to take a breath. They need to consider. And they need to reflect, and we all do it, and we all, of course, race to confusion sometimes. I'll do it as well, of course we will.
Yeah.
But yes, that space for debate, the depersonalization of it, we cannot lose it.
And politics itself, you mentioned earlier on in the interview about how politicians are sort of disregarded a lot of the time and not very well looked up to, and yet you yourself are doing things from your heart where you're helping people. And I guess you must see a lot of other politicians that are doing similar things from all parties. It's not all about power. It is about helping people. Would you say that's fair?
Yes, 100%. And we disagree on how to help people or what the thing is actually so often we all agree on what the outcome is we want to achieve, but we just disagree on the route to getting there. And yeah, I think, look, of course, Parliament is like any job in the world. There is not a company in the world where there's more than 50 people, and we're 650, where people can't find a bad egg, a lazy egg, a super hardworking, quiet mouse egg. We have all of it. We have the good, well-meaning, but not that capable. We have the exceptionally capable, emotionally not very engaged. And we have the lazy and we have the bad. And of course, there are people who are bad who are particularly drawn to this role because they think it would give them amazing influence and abilities and all these different things. That's not what they're going to get if they come for this job. I'll tell them that right now. But yes, you are absolutely right. And I think we are a mirror of our societies, but we have to hold ourselves to higher standards. And, there will be times where, of course, I'll let people down, and we all will. But I just hope it's not in that, awful way. But we have to try harder and do better and work harder. But we are a mirror of our society.
How does the dynamic work when you take a particular position on something? And it might be to do with your local constituents, but then you have to vote on something and the whips are saying you've got to vote this way and you've got to toe the party line, you disagree with it. How do you reconcile that?
So everyone is very different. I chose when we were in government that I was going to be a more independent-minded MP, and I rebelled more than most. So it's interesting, until 2019, most MPs had never rebelled against their own party. And then we were put into this incredible situation around the COVID pandemic. There was also a particular vote in Parliament where I was going to rebel and I didn't. And I regretted that deeply. And I felt I couldn't sleep that night. And God, people love writing to you going, how do you sleep at night? It's hilarious how many emails it's written in. But I couldn't. And from that point on, I said, I must always be able to cope. There are compromises. This is politics. This is the real world. There is not a single job. Find me a job in the world where people are happy with every single thing they're asked to do and how they have to do it. We are asked to do things on the world stage with far more controversy. Look at the pandemic, for example. But, I remember, 103 of us rebelling over vaccine passport because we thought it was the wrong thing to do to bring them in. But also, the vote was actually about preventing a third lockdown. People often don't know in politics why you might be voting a certain way. And everyone thought we were just voting on vaccine passports. We weren't. We were voting to say we didn't want a third lockdown. So I have rebelled probably more than a lot of my colleagues. I've abstained a lot, and I have laid amendments to legislation. And so I think I have balanced it in that I can't win every argument. You can't win every fight, and you have to make sure you pick and choose. But I have been more independent-minded than most, and I think it has allowed me to. I think I was told by the library that no MP since 2019 had changed as much legislation as I did from the backbenches because I laid amendments, because I pushed things through. So you have to be willing to stand up for your views, but you have to be willing to stand up for your constituency. And actually, most whips, if they're decent, will understand when you need to rebel over something because of your communities, and they will allow you to do that. But also, thing I'd say is you should only really lose the whip if you vote against a manifesto commitment. Everything else we should be able to debate and work through.
So if in the next government the Conservatives got in and you got a position in the cabinet, how would that stance change?
I mean, the point is that when you're in the tent, you can fight and argue and change things. There are lots and lots of law changes I achieved that nobody knows about and that I did behind the scenes. And, yes, I told my constituents I had meetings on it. But by doing the work, you don't really want to ever get to the point where you're having to force a vote against your own government because you failed. You want to get all that work done behind the scenes before you get there. And that's what I've always managed to do pretty much. I've never called a vote against my own government because I've managed to win the arguments behind the scenes. One or two I've lost, but you weren't going to win them. So there's no point pushing it to a battle that you're going to lose. But it's the same thing. If you're in government, when I was working as a parliamentary private secretary at DCMS, Huawei, when I went into the department, we were bringing in Huawei. When I left the department, we were not bringing in Huawei. And that wasn't just me. There was, two others in the department who wanted to change our policy, the Secretary of State and one other. And we did it. And this thing, when you're in it, you can change it as the minister and you can have those arguments. You just do it completely privately. And if you're a backbencher, you can do it more publicly, which is very helpful, but you can still do things inside.
So if you did get a cabinet position, what would it be?
Whatever the leader at the time decides they want to give me. I mean, it is not a meritocracy. I mean, look, I won't do anything because I think I have to be able to bring a skill set to it. But essentially, politics is not a meritocracy, and you are slotted into the jigsaw, and that's the piece that you get given.
Well, Alicia, this has been a really fascinating conversation. It's been interesting to learn more about your life serving as an MP, to hear about some of the issues that you work on, and to get to a little more about what we're facing as a country in the context of the wider world. My guest today has been Alicia Kearns. Alicia is a Conservative MP for Rutland and Stamford, and she's currently Shadow Minister for the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And you can find links to Alicia's office in the show notes. Thank you for coming on the show, Alicia.
Thanks for having me. It's been lovely.
You have been listening to Undercurrent Stories. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to share the show link to your friends and family, and if you have 60 seconds, I will be most grateful if you would please rate and review. To hear more episodes, please subscribe to the show and visit undercurrentstories.com. If you leave your email in the link, we will notify you as soon as new episodes are released. Also, check out our social media links, details of which can be found on the show notes. Until next time, this is Bob Wells wishing you all the very best.